Hello and welcome, and thank you for joining us for episode 18 of the Aha Moment. We are excited to be joined here today by Ricardo Guardiola. Ricardo is a member here of the Decision Associates team. He's our strategic foresight advisor. He also does work outside of Decision Associates, which I'll let him talk about in just a moment. But Ricardo, we are so excited to have you here to talk a little bit about a topic called strategic foresight. And it's maybe something that people aren't familiar with. So we're going to talk a little bit about what it is and kind of set the stage first, and then we'll have you go into a little bit more detail. But before we do that, if you could just introduce yourself, please.
Yes, I'm Ricardo Guardiola, and over the past 13 years, I've helped recover over $1 billion in missed opportunities with strategic foresight by doing four things exceptionally well that define the strategic foresight field: predicting emerging demand, proacting with differentiated solutions, helping companies and organizations perform with geographic and industry vertical precision, and outpacing future shocks through scenario planning. These are the four big pieces of strategic foresight that we will be diving into more detail today. Any organization that does these four things really well doesn't have to worry about anticipating change because everybody else will be trying to keep up with them.
Perfect. I love it. So, we're really looking at helping organizations look to the future and figure out what do they need to be focused on, where they need to focus their time and their resources and their attention and their staffing. Really taking the guesswork out of that, right? And who doesn't love that? That sounds like a great plan. So, let's jump into, first of all, a little bit about strategic foresight. So, can you give us a really super basic explanation of what it is? And I think, if you don't mind, I think the lemonade stand analogy that we've talked about in the past is actually a great example.
Yes. So my one sentence definition of strategic foresight is anticipating change early enough to build a competitive edge.
Hmm.
And there's a few keywords in there that I'd like to unpack, but first let's
Sure.
hear it again. It's about anticipating change early enough to build a competitive edge.
Hmm.
So why change instead of future? Because we could also say that we're predicting the future, but that's not really technically what we're doing. We're predicting change.
Hmm.
And this also gives us agency as organizations and as individuals, because what future oriented variables are we interested in? What were ones that we're interested in, ones that will change either for our benefit or against us. So we want to be able to anticipate those, but we also want to anticipate them early enough to make a difference and to build a competitive edge.
Hmm.
Early enough so that it's not obvious to the competition or to the market or to a customer, so that we can build a differentiated moat
Hmm.
about that change that's taking place. And this is relevant for both private sector organizations and also nonprofits, because when we talk about a competitive edge, we're not only talking about market share or revenue, we're also talking about things like mission impact and fundraising development and things of that nature.
Hmm.
And the lemonade stand is very relevant too, because any organization can benefit from strategic foresight, from a lemonade stand to a Fortune 500 and everything in between.
Hmm.
So with the lemonade stand, we want to be able to predict emerging markets. What are the kinds of lemonades and adjacent goods that people demand in their neighborhood and depending on their climate? Because doing like a strategic plan without strategic foresight is almost like building a house without looking at the weather conditions first for that day.
Hmm.
So perhaps if it's the winter time, like right now in Erie, Pennsylvania, perhaps the lemonade stand should also have some baked goods and boiled tea and chocolates and such. Whereas in the summertime, that wouldn't necessarily be maybe an optimal fit.
Hmm.
Proact, we want to be able to build add-ons and syrup flavors that resonate with the needs of the audience
Hmm.
and of the consumer base within that neighborhood. Perhaps one neighborhood really likes cinnamon in their lemonade, and other ones would find it too tart or bitter for their taste. So we have to be able to pivot.
Hmm.
Performing is about choosing the right place in the neighborhood. We need to be able to evaluate what other fundraisers or what other things are being sold and figure out the optimal place to be able to service as much as that market as possible. Many times you'll see a McDonald's and a Burger King right across from each other because they've independently done market research or strategic foresight and determined that that's the best place to be.
Hmm.
There are pros and cons to that scenario. Also, outpacing. We want the lemonade stand has to remain compliant and be able to anticipate future trends, whether it's lemonades, any regulations about the government about lemonade sales, but also any maybe impending diseases or famines that might affect the lemonades, because it's very similar to orange juice. So Florida oranges are really great for drinking
Hmm.
orange juice, but not so good for eating versus the oranges that you'll find on the West Coast in California. They don't really make a great taste for orange juice, but they're really good for just eating a raw orange. So
Hmm.
even things to that is mission critical for a strategic foresight initiative.
Absolutely. So it's really just using the data that's available and using it to understand what trends, what might be happening, what changes might be happening that are on the horizon, and preparing in accordance with those, and adjusting your strategy, adjusting your plan, so that you're in the best position possible to be successful moving forward. So I think that's a great kind of basic summary to help people understand what we're talking about. So, what would you say? I think we hear this a lot. Well, isn't strategic foresight just market research? Aren't they the same thing? So, what's your response to that?
Market research is an adjacency and many times an input to a
Mhm.
true strategic foresight project or deliverable. So, a market research would be maybe looking at the current or the past,
Mhm.
a pulse of what the situation is today. So, if the market size for manufacturing fasteners for oil and gas towers in the Gulf of Mexico might be $1 billion USD, that's market research. That's not strategic foresight. If there's a project that determines that there's $10 million in revenue that's possible from donors based off of donors in certain postal codes, that would be market research.
Mhm.
But then determining whether those trends will go up or down and over what time frame, that would be strategic foresight. And a relevant example could even be the COVID pandemic. So in 2020, many organizations were caught off guard by the COVID pandemic. But even as early as 2009 and 2010, when I was starting my career in university, there were already some Fortune 500s and government organizations that were coming up with high impact, low probability scenarios, also known as black swans,
Mhm.
that could fundamentally impact global trends and global business. And one of those was the risk of a pandemic, completely requiring quarantine and completely changing public life.
Mhm.
So even as far back as 2008 and 2009, there were some organizations that were already planning for a scenario like that.
Mhm. Fascinating. So interesting. So talking a little bit about, you mentioned it just a minute ago, the concept of using strategic foresight as part of a strategic planning process. So, most organizations engage in some kind of 3 to 5 year planning cycle, but oftentimes they're only really looking in that rear view mirror. They're looking at historical or backwards, or even just the present circumstances. They're not really looking at, they're thinking about what needs to happen in the future, but in order to inform that, they're looking at the present and the past. So, what would be your advice to them to help them reframe their thinking and truly look at what's coming in the future?
Yeah, strategy is a fascinating topic, and I'm an avid board game player. And the way I think about strategy is any move or any decision that places at risk a significant portion of that organization's resources.
Hmm.
So that is strategy or a strategic decision. And where strategic foresight comes into play in strategic planning as helping figure out what are the factors that are critical to our success or failure,
Hmm.
but are outside of our immediate span of control, that can either significantly improve or not improve our current position or current strategic planning.
Hmm.
And not all of them are dramatic black swan scenarios like COVID pandemic or tariffs or emerging regulation. Some of those can be a little bit more nuanced, but still have a big impact. An example could be maybe the part of our partnership base or part of our customers might become a competitor, like
Hmm.
what happened with Disney and Netflix in 2014.
Hmm.
Disney Plus came around in 2017, By 2014, through a project I did, that was already something that was being predicted. Something so those nuances can happen at that level as well.
Mhm. Absolutely. Perfect. So, at what point in the process, I guess, if you think of a strategic planning process, at what point in the process does it make sense to start to bring in some of this data? Is it something that would be like pre-work that's done ahead of time? Does it happen during the planning process? When would you recommend that an organization brings this in if they were looking to do that as part of their strategic planning?
As part of their strategic planning, I always recommend that the organization already has at least a draft idea
Mm,
of what their vision and mission statement is.
mhm,
What is it that you want to mean to the world and the vision, and what is your movie of the future? If everything goes right, what is your ideal scenario 5 years into the future?
mhm,
That can be very interesting, and many organizations find when they do a brainstorming exercise that maybe all the stakeholders aren't really aligned on those 2 points. But the more
mm,
alignment that are on those 2 points before strategic foresight comes into play, the better. Because then now that we have a concrete idea of what we want our vision and mission to be, we can have a serious conversation about what are the biggest gaps in uncertainty in
mhm,
our market or our competitive set. And then once we list out all of those gaps, we can begin to quantify which ones are the most important or addressable for our current and future success.
mhm. Absolutely. And what about organizations that already have a strategic plan that they're working on and they're feeling like maybe there's a need to kind of course correct? Um,
Mhm.
how does that work? Incorporating this strategic foresight, information into a plan that's already in the implementation phase.
Scenario planning is a quick win in that instance,
Hmm.
where there's already a concrete strategic plan that's in motion, and the organization needs to find the early warning signals
Mm,
that point to the strategic plan needing to be pivoted into another direction.
hmm.
And then by building different scenarios, it's also possible to then build a tripwire. So if we see that an X number of competitors are moving into our space, we already have like a sub item in our strategic plan that will help address that. Or if the economy goes down by more than 10%, we already have a tripwire in place to help that happen. That's how scenario planning can help an existing strategic plan in a relatively fast amount of time.
Hmm. How have you seen organizations really balance the long-term trend component with the immediate realities that they're facing? Because a lot of times, especially in the nonprofit sector where there are
Mhm.
concerns about funding and staffing, and limited resources, how do you balance that forward thinking with the reality of the current situation?
So this is controversial even within the strategic foresight field. If you go
Mm,
to any of the conferences that happen in the US or abroad, there's debate and controversy about balancing the immediate quick wins versus the long-term wins.
mhm,
Because there are voices out there that will say to build a strategic foresight function, you need a year or more to start seeing value of it.
mm,
But my perspective on this topic is that any organization of any size, nonprofit, privately held company, can yield benefits from strategic foresight in as little as 10 hours
mhm,
if the problem and the proposed key strategic research question is defined appropriately.
mhm,
And it is important to balance the short, quick wins versus the long-term wins. And a great way to do that would be looking at what the serviceable addressable market is today based off of the existing products and solutions and mapping that towards more aspirational targets
mhm,
about, again, referencing the vision and the mission. What do we want to mean? What do we want to be able to do 3 to 5 years from now? And building more longer term views backed by quantitative statistics about what could potentially be possible within a 5 year period, but only if the next 1 to 2 years are successful. And then if
mhm.
they're not successful, how can we then pivot it around?
Sure. And I love that advice of having the mission and the vision, and I would add values too, to having those set. And that's for profit or nonprofit organizations, by the way. That's for both. Because you need that measure by which you're comparing what needs to happen. Okay, does this particular trend that is coming down the pipeline that we need to be aware of and prepared for, does it align with what we're looking to do and where we want to go with the organization? Because if the answer is no, then let's not spend time and resources and team power pursuing something that's not in alignment with where we want to go. So I think that's excellent
Yeah.
advice. And I just want to highlight that again as a
Yeah.
really important point to prepare for before you dive into this.
And that also reminds me, one thing that also sets apart strategic foresight from market research is that strategic foresight takes into account and can tackle information that's out there but might be inherently deceptive.
Mm,
Because especially now, where in 2025, over 50% of the information generated on the net is generated by AI. Some of those AIs have good intentions. Some of
mhm,
those are malicious actors that are putting out AI slop and disinformation on purpose.
mhm,
So any statistical or quantitative technique to do research or foresight has to be able to filter out deception. And there's also, beyond deception from artificial intelligence actors, competitors can also throw smoke screens
mm,
where they say that they have this new product or new technology, but how much revenue are they actually getting from it? Is it something that they've actually built at scale, or is something that they're piloting with maybe one or two people?
mhm,
Or if there's a partnership in a specific industry vertical or in a specific city, state, or country, is that really where they're hedging their bets? Or is it more of a low stakes play or planting the seed for potential future growth? Because
mhm,
there's definitely been organization situations where somebody writes me a WhatsApp message or sends me a text message and says, Ricardo, our competitor just did this. And then we have to assess, is this really something that should be on the radar, or is this more of a smokescreen that they
mhm,
threw to kind of get people off of their trail?
mhm. And I think this actually raises an interesting area of questioning, which is, you know, for organizations that are listening to this podcast and they're thinking about, oh, this is something that I'd be interested in pursuing, for my organization. Is this something that organizations can do on their own? The strategic foresight component, can they go at it alone, or do they need to partner with somebody who has a background like yours?
It is possible for any organization to start the process through what I call a structured analytical technique,
Hmm.
where a structured analytical technique is anything that's meant to A, produce an actionable forecast about the future, about some element in the future,
Hmm.
but B, also visualize the analysis for review and critique. And can they do it on their own? My answer to that is two pronged. Yes, they can go at it on their own in the same way that if I went out to Home Depot and bought a tool set, I could build a house on my
The question is, how good of a house do you
own.
want?
Yeah, you do not want me volunteering to build houses. I will tell you that.
Ricardo's on the research, maybe not the house building. Perfect. Yeah, I think that's a great example is, when you think about certain functions within an organization where just having the people who do this day in and day out and are used to looking at the data and creating the models and creating the scenarios. I do think, and having worked with you and seen what those outputs look like, with the scenario planning especially, I think having somebody who has that expertise is incredibly valuable and just helps the process, I think, move more efficiently and effectively, which when you're, planning for the next 3 to 5 years, who doesn't want that? I think that efficiency and effectiveness is important.
Yeah, and many times the analytics and the visuals are important from a change management perspective, where
Mhm.
maybe you have to convince a board or a set of stakeholders within the organization or partners outside of the organization about why we think or we believe that this course of action is the best, and what are some of the contingencies we have in place if something changes.
Mhm, absolutely. And so for smaller organizations, especially those smaller nonprofits maybe that have, as I mentioned, the limited time, limited budgets, but who want to take advantage of something like this, what would a solution look like for them?
Yep. as I mentioned earlier in the podcast, I believe any organization could realize tangible value from strategic foresight in as little as 10 hours.
Hmm.
It's not something that necessarily takes a lot of time. It does take a lot of expertise.
Hmm.
Um, so then the answer is tying it to a key gap in awareness or certainty.
Hmm.
And in different parts of the company life cycle, that could be looking at the emerging sets of markets or looking at the products or solutions that need to be built or deciding in which geographies or industry verticals to invest time and attention and resources
Hmm.
or looking at scenario planning. There's a structured analytical technique for any one of these solutions, and it's reproducible and transparent because it's very important that all of these analyses are reproducible from the standpoint of anyone can see exactly what went into it and what the output was. And this also makes for great facilitation discussions because if
Yes.
during the course of a presentation somebody believes that a certain variable should be weighted more or less, that can be done in real time. And
Hmm.
the ideal fit score for any of these decisions under consideration will then be immediately adapted in real time so people can see them.
Hmm. Definitely. So, could you give kind of, and you've done a couple of them, but I'd like to see sort of start to finish. Could you give a sort of hypothetical example of that's maybe based in something that's happened? Could you give an example of what this would look like in practice? Where, okay, here's the question that the client was asking. Here's the information
Mhm.
that I provided to them, and ultimately, here was the change that they made and the outcome that resulted.
Yes. So some of the highest impact ones, we don't know that it's going to be high impact until the project is done and we see the outcome.
Sure.
And this was the case for an organization that was looking to sell their organization to a larger company
Hmm.
because they thought that their core industry segment was going away.
Okay.
Back in the 2016, 2017 period, there was a coal crisis within the United States.
Mhm.
And many industry and public media voices thought that maybe coal was going away as a power source.
Mhm.
And, and looking at the data and determining the plausible futures, what we found is that, yes, many of the coal power plants that were being serviced by rail or by roadways were potentially going to be adapted into something else.
Hmm.
But all of the coal that was being serviced and transported by river barges was all going to stay exactly the way it was. And the demand was actually going to increase because as coal power plants that were being serviced by alternative methods of transportation were going off the grid, these power plants actually had to increase the amount of coal consumption to make up for the US power grid. So, doing all this market modeling and such, we were able to convince both the buyer and the seller that as a multiplier of earnings, their company was actually worth twice what the owner initially thought it was worth. So, this was maybe a key success story from being able to predict the emerging markets.
Hmm. Definitely. I think that's a great example. So if I'm a listener listening to today's episode and I'm thinking, "Oh, my organization's doing some planning and I think this is something we should be talking about and considering as part of our process." What are some talking points that you would give them if they're not the decision maker to ultimately decide to engage with someone like you or an organization that does strategic foresight? What are some talking points you'd give them to use with the decision maker to help convince them?
Yep. So, the nature and the scope of the strategic decisions that take place are often in the hundreds of thousands, if not tens of millions of dollars.
Mhm.
And if we feel very confidently, or if we're unsure about the decisions that we're making, and these are things that fundamentally define the future success of our business, does it make sense to invest a few grand to confirm that this is the right way forward,
Mhm.
knowing that the stakes could not be higher? That,
Yeah.
that's 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 one talking point that resonates well with many audiences.
Yeah, I agree. And so one other thing I'd like to have you touch on is as this process gets started, you have somebody who comes to you and says, hey, Ricardo, I'd love for you to do some research on this and some scenario planning and help us understand what changes are coming that we need to be prepared for. What sort of input or data do you need from them in order to get a process started?
Typically, their vision and mission statement, if it's not already publicly available somewhere that I can see it.
Hmm.
In many cases, it is. And then it's useful to look at, to the extent possible, their current financials,
Mm.
just so that I can compare how they're doing as an organization versus the overall market, whether it's
Hmm.
nonprofit or for profit.
Hmm.
And then if they've ever done any primary surveys to their consumer base,
Hmm.
that's also good to help triangulate some market sources and the voice of the market.
Hmm.
What I don't, and it's also great to hear about their internal hypotheses. So if I have those pieces, we can then start a strategic foresight process. And many times I think that this is great, that there's not too many. There has to be some check-ins, but not too many, because oftentimes it's brought to my attention that what the organization really wants is kind of our data-backed scientific view,
Hmm.
and not maybe biased too much about what they currently think internally. So I think
Hmm.
that's important to recognize as well, that we're not just taking what people say and making it the source of truth for the market research and the strategic foresight models,
Hmm.
but that we're taking it as one of many inputs and weighing it across other inputs as well.
Hmm. Absolutely. And if someone decides that they want some of this work done, and obviously we would love it if they would use you for this work because you do it so well. But if they decide that they want to try to find their own provider, what are some of the things that they should be looking for to determine, is this provider going to ultimately be able to get me what I'm looking for and really help provide that insight and that foresight that I need?
Transparency and process is a
Mhm.
big one. What are the methodologies or structured analytical techniques
Mhm.
that they will be using? And what are some of their key sources? Because a competent analyst has over 110 structured analytical techniques they can use
Mhm.
for any given problem. But it's a matter of determining which one makes the most sense for the given problem and being able to do it in a way that's reproducible and transparent.
Mhm.
So that's a big one. You can also ask them what is their batting average, or what has their accuracy rate been in the past,
Yeah.
because no one's accuracy is 100%, even if they can pick and choose which projects are the best fit, because sometimes it could be a scenario where, in this particular example, in this particular case, maybe strategic foresight isn't the right fit, and if it's not, I'm happy to say that.
Yeah.
And then, but then, yes, asking what their batting average or historical accuracy is, and the forecasting that they've already done in their career
Mhm.
is another good one.
Yeah, that's very, very helpful. Thank you. So as we prepare to wrap up here, what are some final kind of parting thoughts that you would share with somebody who's listening to this episode today and they're still trying to decide if this is the right route or not? What would your kind of takeaway, if you walk away from this podcast with nothing else today, I would tell you to walk away with this one point. What would that be?
Interesting. I would tell them to walk away with committing to themselves to do a little bit more reading on different structured analytical techniques
Mhm.
that can help inform forecasting and strategic planning decision making. Oftentimes, people know of the big ones from the private sector, like the Boston Consulting Group
Mhm.
Growth Share Matrix, or Porter's Five Corners, for Four Corners, or Porter's Five Forces.
Mhm.
But there's other ones that are just as powerful or more, but haven't received the same level of attention,
Mm.
such as the analysis of competing hypotheses that was initially developed by the CIA and then repurposed for private sector.
Mhm.
Same thing with um, multi-criteria intelligence matrices, where we can take any decision and quantify the different variables.
Mhm.
So I would ask people to look into those and see what they think. And also, Now that artificial intelligence and especially agentic AI is really taking off, there are several institutes and voices out there that are doing cutting edge forecasting competitions that are putting groups of humans against groups of AIs and
Ooh.
to see which approach works best and how both approaches together produce the best forecasting accuracy.
Mhm.
So a deep dive into that is also relevant for any organization right now.
Definitely. Fascinating. This is such a great topic. All right. Well, that is everything we wanted to have you cover today, and we're so grateful for you taking some time out of your schedule to join us today. And so, again, we were extremely happy to have Ricardo Guardiola here with us, talking about all things strategic foresight. Thank you to Ricardo again for being here. It was a pleasure to have you.
Yes, this has been a swagalicious conversation. I hope that everybody gets some next steps out of it about contemplating their life and the universe and how they can have the best impact on the world.
Love it. All right. Well, thank you to all of our listeners, of course, for tuning in to this episode of the Aha Moment. We would love it if you would subscribe on Spotify to our podcast. You can also learn a little bit more about us, Decision Associates, on LinkedIn and our website, decisionassociates.net. Thank you again, Ricardo. Thank you to our listeners, and we will catch you next time.